Now, and we're recording the Duende, which is, I will go on to say, in the instruction of young warriors, this focuses upon the wily and cunning tricks played by a character called Coyote. And some social anthropologists have ascribed the brilliant warfare stratagems of that 19th century Apache war chief, Geronimo, as the practical embodiment of these lessons, which he implemented in deceiving and eluding the very best West Point trained officers of the United States Army, who commanded troops outnumbering this savage raider by tenfold or more. You know, it was amazing that Geronimo was able to wreak havoc with so few people in his war bands. And the movements of the United States Army had no such understanding of the coyote principles, or the principles of Duende being involved in being, well, implemented on the field of battle. By the way, I always like to make a note that the greatest warriors in the Native American nations were supposedly the Cherokee, who actually gave over command of their troops often to women who became field marshals in combat. And isn't it amazing that the president of the Cherokee Nation, until very recently, had the surname of Mankiller, Mary Mankiller, or Chain Mounting, it doesn't matter. I used to go out with a girl who was Native American, and her last name was Gutspiller, because her family used to render the buffaloes after they'd been killed, and their family used to rip open the belly. Oh, that's another whole story. And anyway, in the sparse fragments preserved from 8th century Anglo-Saxon writing, transcribed from oral formulaic verse, located especially in the Beowulf saga, there are references to magical creatures described as eotenish, that is, elfin or gnomic, elves or gnomes, in the substantive grammatical case, Aotans. And by the way, on my little car, the smart car I have, is the license plate Aotan, which means elf or gnome. And although J.R.R. Tolkien attempted to trace their origin in his seminal essay, Beowulf, the Beasts and the Critics, he was unable to exactly identify these beings, as did a scholar later, who determined earlier in his 1911 doctoral dissertation, that these creatures most likely were biblical, that is, presuming the author of Beowulf had any early Christian influences, and to have been the progeny of Lilith. That was Adam's first wife, expelled from paradise for her refusal to be dominated by first man. Lilith, who thrived east of Eden in the land of Nod, where Cain was exiled, as well as all of the others that were there. They survived the great flood, and they weren't being allowed passage onto Noah's Ark for sure, and yet they had evolved into amphibian creatures, presumably with gills or some other survival evolutionary freak adaptation, but were on the order of monsters. When these phenomenal survivalists were encountered in Beowulf, they were also discovered to be the artisans of weaponry that could penetrate any known armor, and their own bodies were proof against any contemporary cutting or piercing implements. Excalibur, of the early English hero Arturus Rex, King Arthur, he possessed this sort of magic, and it was one of the eotenish lethal weapons which Beowulf stumbled across and picked up from the floor of Grendel's mother's murky grotto. Both she and her spawn were definitively Jotun, with which he was able thereby to murder her. These superior alloyed items of warrior cutlery were much like our tempered steel of modern times. In Greek mythology, such superior metal was fashioned by the Cyclopean inhabitants of caves, where the mining of the ferrous ore was smelted into alloys forged into superior tools of warfare, forged steel, which became the formidable sidearms of later conquering warriors. Therefore, it would seem that these mythical Cyclops characters were actually those beings who appeared to be one-eyed, looking monocular, because they wore miner's lamps strapped to their foreheads. Well, that's mythography. That was what Robert Graves first taught me about. Actually, he gave me that example himself about the Cyclopes, about the Cyclopean people, the people who were smelting metal back in the caves. And when they were seen, they seemed to have one eye. Well, that was their miner's lantern on their foreheads. Well, that's so much for the very beginning of the book of the Duende, and I'm going to play then some music that will be of a more salubrious nature. And that's a little bit of that, classical guitar music. And now we're getting to the classical part of this program, which is still on KUHS LP 102.5 FM. And I'm going to read you the very beginning of the Duende book that I wrote. I know this sounds strange, but I spent many years writing this book. And it came to be the shortest book I've ever written. I'm editing another book right now. I'm a writer. I don't know how many writers you know. But this other book has taken me the better part of 8 years to write the first draft. And now I'm doing the editing, which is probably going to be maybe a year and a half. But it's this book, The Duende. I began working on the ideas and making notes about it a long time ago. And only in the past couple of years was it finally published in 2015. It is available at the Garland Library. I gave 2 copies to them, and I think they paid me money for them as well. I'm going to read to you the first example of peak experience as experienced in, of all places, a death camp, a concentration camp. And that term was first used in the Boer War at the turn of the century down in South Africa with the Afrikaans forces against the British forces, fighting over who had the right to enforce apartheid and take the diamonds and the gold and all the riches from African people. And Nelson Mandela finally was able to end all of that and become the president of the African nations. But by the way, he had his own peak experiences in prison and came out a transformed man. But this is about a death camp called Auschwitz. The sense of peak experience, or the quintessential height of excitation, however, for the individual emotional state described as duende, can be related to extreme points of awareness felt in life in threatening danger, or deep valence, sensual experiences of pleasure. In his memoirs of survival from internment at the Second World War death camp Auschwitz, entitled Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor E. Frankl tells of focusing his mind on the image of his beloved wife, whom he discovered only after his liberation and release from this concentration camp, that she had been sent to the gas chambers and then incinerated in the crematorium on the very day they both arrived, several years before, which he had believed had maintained his spirit of hope and will to survive. he compares this sacred image to a light he calls lux tenebris, which he also was able to then perceive an actual luminescence issuing from a distant farmhouse on a hillside horizon of that bleak, miserable gray landscape where he had been set to toiling in slave labor. But he kept thinking she was alive, and she was his lux tenebris, that flickering light. He often repeated the phrase, ex lux in tenebris lucid, and the light shineth in darkness. This was his duende, a saving state of grace from the constant threat of execution in the Auschwitz gas chambers, which exterminated so many of his comrades. Frankel's belief generated his theory, which he called logotherapy, discovered as he endured incarceration, and it was the conviction that he had a meaning in his life, purpose for surviving the tortures and degradations of the concentration camp in comparison to men who gave up hope, lost their desire to endure and prevail, and therefore died. This may be why I, myself, have always survived and later savored and cherished the images and memories of what appeared to be potential death sentences, physically endangering circumstances such as 2 life-threatening incidents afloat in small boats in savage storms. One, force 11 to 12 on the Beaufort scale in the North Sea, in a minefield, and the other, a tornado on Lake Erie. I'm going to read to you this particular example, and I will do so after we have gone on to play another example of some music. And that's just about where we're going to end on that, because Big Ben and Company performing here for you. But I'm going to carry on with reading to you from Duende, and then I may slip into a little Mongolian music, which we haven't heard for a while. That will be a bit of a shock to your system. But right now, I wanted to just read you this first example of my experience, most startling experience I've ever had of a kind of prolonged sense of duende. I told you, oftentimes this sense of epiphany, it can be, in a bullfight or a flamenco dance when they shout "Olé," but I was actually shouting "Olé, Olé" as this was happening over a period of hours in the North Sea, and the Nachen 2, N-A-C-H-E-N, number 2, of Sam Coughing, a 50-foot catch rig, that is with a mainmast and a mizzenmast, and we had 2 enormous diesel engines. We actually were sailing without sails. We had just gone by the poles. We tied everything down, and we were being in a storm of 110 to 120 miles an hour in seas going from trough to crest of 40 feet, trough to crest of 40 feet, in a minefield in the North Sea for 10 hours. We came through it, came into the island of Borkum. I'll read you this experience, but what a sense of ecstasis, extended ecstasis. Olé, olé, olé. In July 1966, when I was harnessed to the wheel, aft of the mizzenmast on the 50-foot ketch Knockin' To in a Beaufort scale 11 gale gusting to force 12. That's winds of 110 miles per hour, increasing to 120 and more, with seas whose troughs rose to crests over 40 feet in height as the boat sludged through the dark, turbulent waters on bare poles. That's the nautical term for reefing, tying down all sails to the masts and booms. And both six-cylinder diesel engines were providing full power to our screws, our propellers, driving us through this blasting, blistering, raging, and punishing storm in the North Sea minefields. Nobody knew whether they were contact, sonic, or pressure-activated explosives, as they had been laid there by the German Navy fleet in World War II over 2 decades before. This was several miles off the Frisian Islands of northern Germany, one of which, Borkum, became our refuge harbor finally, after over 12 hours of enduring these combined threats, yet making our way through to close at last on the quay, Q-U-A-Y, where we made fast our mooring there, as over 20 other boats and ships had not. Having gone down, they having gone under, sinking to the bottom of that sea with all hands lost. I had been spelled at the helm every 15 minutes by either David Dale, my fellow crew member, or by Sam Coffing, the owner and captain. And I had gulped hot coffee or whiskey, Jack Daniels Black Label, straight from the neck of the bottle when I was down below, forward of the cockpit in the main saloon, where Susie, David's partner, and Marion, my fiancée, were stationed out of harm's way, although Marion's nose was broken by her being tossed bodily across that space into a bulkhead. Yet she had made no complaint and held a dish towel with crushed ice to her face to staunch the pain. Ever after, in the years of our companionship and subsequent marriage, I always looked on her otherwise refined patrician mane at the crooked bridge of that nose with nostalgic affection. Anyway, this is triggering repeatedly my treasuring of Duende for that perfect storm, an irreplaceable, inimitable moment of peak survivalist awareness. Anyway, although I distinctly recall extended reveries I experienced while stationed at the boat's helm, that is, the wheel, strapped to that wheel in the cockpit as the yacht rolled over again and again to sink her gunwales into the dark water, immersing that portion of the decks into the yawning deep, so that it seemed miraculous that the entire vessel would right herself and swing back to the other side in the same violent sweep, the masts making a 45-degree angle against the jagged horizontal plane. And this moment, as it is called in nautical parlance, taking no more than 4 to 5 seconds as I counted it out, 1 crocodile, 2 crocodile, 3 crocodile, 4. We were proceeding under full power by those twin diesels before the wind, just enough way being made so that the sea did not roll over our stern, swamping that cockpit, Neptune's jaws gaping voraciously at our hind parts. The roar of the wind in the bare poles, whose stays had been made fast, played a cacophonous, slapping, high-pitched Spike Jones paean to our destiny and possible termination in being gobbled whole by that prodigious liquid power. Poseidon was so often depicted as a giant with wrathful physiognomy. I also envisioned, some small thanks to my passion for the Spanish corrida, the bullfight, a raging bull of impersonal brute force and preternatural power. Our communion of hot food and cold drink that night, when we were at last tied securely at Borkum's dockside, was punctuated by David Dale's recounting how half the spectators turned and walked away as our boat slammed into that stone mooring. They had lost their wager that we would capsize and go down, even as we had breached the harbor and finally found refuge. Their bets were forfeit, as our own lives were redeemed. Sam broke out his most precious brandy that evening, a 30-year-old rarity he'd been saving for our arrival in Copenhagen. Ironically, we quaffed from this bottle once more in the midst of our transit of the Balky, after we'd gone through the Kiel Canal from Brunsbüttel at the Elbe River, only a few days later, when I had misnavigated into East German line fields and then set a reverse course, correcting for drift and narrowly escaping another death-dealing dilemma. Marion and I made love that night on the Frisian island in Borkum, in a surreptitious cuddle behind the blanket curtain in the single berth we shared in tangled, intensive passion. Even though she and I had but one orgasm each, the entire crew had shared a Duende, an even greater peak experience, derivative of having what had been a sustained, throbbing sensation of near death for over 12 hours in the ragged embrace of Neptune's unrelenting and punishing seas surrounding those frigid Frisian Isles. I'm going to stop with that and actually segue over to some music that seems appropriate to that kind of a moment, and that is Mongolian music. And I think that is enough Mongolian overtone chanting for anybody, for especially Big Ben and company. And we're going to break with this and say goodbye till next week. We look forward to see you again with a little more, well, actually quite a bit more Duende. Folks, on till then.